Welcome back, everyone, to Beyond the Darkness. Tonight, we're diving into 5 true, creepy, and scary stories from the Appalachian Mountains. These woods may look calm from the outside, but the deeper you go, the more you'll realize they hide things you were never meant to see. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, turn off the lights, settle in, and let's begin. If you've ever set foot in the Appalachian Mountains during autumn, you know the feeling. The crisp bite of early morning air, the faint scent of pine drifting on the breeze, and the distant sound of dry leaves crunching under the weight of unseen creatures. But hidden beneath that peaceful picture are stories locals only whisper about, because some believe that speaking them aloud might draw unwanted attention. I first heard about the abandoned deer hunter's cabin from an old man in a small town, no more than 10 miles from the forest. He told me, "Chick, if the sky turns dark and the rain catches you out there, find shelter anywhere, except that old cabin by the creek. Out there, it's not just the rain that'll come looking for you." His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a seriousness that made me believe this wasn't just a tall tale. That day, I was out with 2 friends, Kevin and Mark, looking to photograph the fall colors. We didn't plan to go deep into the woods, but the weather had other plans. Dark clouds rolled in, the wind picked up, and thunder grumbled somewhere far off. We needed shelter. That's when Mark, always the adventurous one, pointed toward a narrow, overgrown path. "Probably leads to an old hunting shack or something," he said. We followed the trail, each step crunching through leaves that seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness of the forest. Soon, the silhouette of a cabin emerged through the misty curtain of rain. It was small, built of weathered timber, its roof sagging in places, with windows boarded over by warped planks. But it wasn't the decay that unsettled me. It was the line of deer heads mounted across the front wall. Though dulled by years of exposure, their glass eyes seemed to glint, as if watching. "Rain's picking up. Let's get inside," Kevin said, paying no mind to the unsettling display. We climbed the creaking porch steps, each groan of the wood sounding like a reluctant welcome. The door, strangely, wasn't locked. It swung open with a long, aching squeal of its hinges, blending with the moan of wind through the trees, a sound that made my skin prickle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and dust. Faint light filtered through a single uncovered window, illuminating the mounted deer heads lining every wall. There were more here than outside, each placed neatly, almost ceremonially. I could swear that when I stepped in, one of them tilted its head toward me, but when I blinked, it was still. Probably just my mind playing tricks under the dim light. Mark gave an impressed whistle. "This place is perfect for Halloween photos," he grinned, snapping away with his camera. Kevin found a worn chair near the fireplace and sat down, shaking off the rain. I, on the other hand, stayed close to the door, a knot tightening in my stomach. Outside, the rain beat harder against the roof, wind howling through the forest. But beneath the wind, I caught something else. A faint, deliberate sound, like footsteps crunching slowly through leaves. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, but the steps were measured, steady, and getting closer. And I glanced at Kevin. "You hear that?" He frowned, listening for a moment, then shook his head. "It's nothing. You're just spooking yourself." But the moment he said that, a dull thump echoed from just outside the wall. A heavy, deliberate knock, as if someone had struck the boards with their hand. Kevin's eyes flicked toward mine, and I knew he heard it too. Mark was still too absorbed in his photos to notice, but I knew the rain wasn't the only thing that had found us out here. The sound came again. Thump, a pause. Then another thump, slower this time. It wasn't the random creak of wood in a storm. It was purposeful. Kevin stood, glancing toward the door like he was about to check outside, but I shook my head. "Don't," I whispered. I wasn't sure why, but every instinct told me that whatever was out there didn't want to be seen. Mark finally lowered his camera, clearly annoyed that we were interrupting his photo spree. "It's just a branch or something. This place is ancient. Every noise sounds creepy." He laughed, but it was the kind of laugh people use to convince themselves they're not scared. The rain kept hammering the roof, masking most of the outside noise. But every so often, there was another thump. Sometimes it came from the door, sometimes from the far wall, as if someone or something was circling the cabin. I tried to distract myself by scanning the interior. A rusted pot still hung over the fireplace. An old coat was slung over the back of a chair, its fabric stiff and mildewed. Above the mantel was the largest mounted deer head of them all, its antlers spreading wide, nearly touching the ceiling beams. The glass eyes caught the light from a flash of lightning, and for a split second, I thought I saw moisture glisten at the corner of its mouth. My breath hitched. I blinked, and it was gone. Kevin muttered, "We should just wait it out. If it's some hiker messing with us, they'll get bored." But the next sound wasn't a thump. It was a slow, scraping noise along the outside wall, right behind where Kevin was standing. He froze mid-step. The scrape traveled, moved past him, and stopped right by the window. We all stared at the boarded-up planks. Nothing moved, but behind them, I swore I saw a faint shadow. Too tall, too thin to be any normal person. Mark tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's the old hunter, back for his trophies." He chuckled, but it died in his throat when the mounted deer heads shifted. It was subtle, just the tiniest turn of glass eyes, the slightest tilt of a jaw, but it was enough for all three of us to see it. And suddenly, the room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward. Kevin whispered, Did that just..." Before he could finish, another lightning flash lit up the room, bright as day. For a heartbeat, I saw them, every mounted head staring directly at us. And their expressions weren't blank anymore. There was something in those faces now, something aware. The thunder boomed overhead, and the momentary light vanished, plunging us back into shadow. Mark dropped his camera to his side, his knuckles white around it. "Let's go," he said flatly. I was already moving toward the door when the handle turned on its own, slowly, deliberately. Kevin lunged forward, slamming it shut and holding it there. "There's someone out there," he hissed. But I didn't think it was someone, at least not anymore. The boards over the window rattled violently, and from outside came a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural breathing. Not human, not animal. Something in between. Mark backed toward the fireplace, gripping a broken chair leg like a weapon. The deer heads seemed to loom larger in the dim light, their antlers casting twisted shadows across the walls. I could feel their eyes on us, tracking every movement. Then the breathing stopped. Total silence. The kind of silence that presses in on your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. We didn't move. None of us even dared to breathe too loudly. And that's when, from the farthest corner of the cabin, something inside the shadows exhaled. The sound of that breath coming from inside the cabin froze us in place. It wasn't a sigh. It wasn't the creak of old wood. It was deliberate, like something had been holding its breath and decided now was the time to let it out. Kevin's eyes darted toward the corner where the darkness was thickest. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. No answer. Only the faint drip of water from the roof and the distant roll of thunder outside. Then, as if responding to his question, one of the mounted deer heads, an old buck with one antler broken, shifted. It didn't just move. It lifted its head from the wall. The sound was horrible, like nails tearing free from wood, mixed with the soft snap of something organic. Dust fell in a small cloud as the head turned and looked directly at us. Kevin stumbled back against the door, fumbling for the handle, but the wood beneath his palm felt strangely warm, as if something was pressing on the other side. Mark whispered, "We need to get out. Now." I didn't argue. The air felt heavier with each second, thick enough to taste, carrying a faint metallic tang. The shadows along the walls were stretching unnaturally, bending toward us, and in those shadows, the shapes of antlers multiplied, branching, twisting, reaching. The broken antler buck opened its mouth, not wide, not unnaturally, just enough for a sound to seep out. It was low, guttural, almost like the breathing we'd heard before, but deeper, older, and it came from inside its throat. I reached for the door handle. This time it turned easily, but what I saw outside was worse than staying in. The rain had stopped. The forest was unnaturally still, not a single leaf moving, but every tree trunk within sight was adorned with mounted deer heads, just like the ones in the cabin, each one staring toward the door. "Shut it!" Kevin hissed, shoving the door closed again. The moment the latch clicked, the cabin groaned. Not from the storm, but as if the whole structure had inhaled. A slow creak rolled through the floorboards under our feet. The deer heads on the wall tilted ever so slightly, their glassy eyes locking onto us again. Mark gripped his makeshift weapon tighter. "I don't care what's out there. I'm not staying." He didn't finish the sentence. A loud crack split the air, and the largest deer head above the fireplace lunged forward, antlers slamming into the mantel. Its glass eyes shattered, but what stared out from the empty sockets wasn't hollow. It was moving. We bolted. I don't remember who opened the door first, or how we made it past those motionless, watching heads in the forest. All I remember is running, branches whipping my face, the squelch of mud underfoot, Kevin shouting somewhere behind me. When we finally burst out onto the main trail, the storm clouds were gone. The air was clear. The world felt normal again. We didn't stop running until the cabin was far behind us. None of us said a word the whole way back to town. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I saw outside the cabin, the rows of heads on the trees, the way their eyes followed us. And just before dawn, when exhaustion finally pulled me under, I thought I heard it again. 3 heavy thumps, slow and deliberate, against the wall of my bedroom. When I looked in the morning, there were no marks, but right there outside my window was a single deer antler, lodged deep into the earth, pointing straight at my house. There's a place in the Appalachian Mountains where the mornings seem to last forever. The sun rises late, the valleys fill with a thick silver fog, and the world feels hushed, like it's holding its breath. Locals say the fog there isn't just weather, it's a veil. And if you're unlucky, you might hear something on the other side of it. I'd been told about the valley by my cousin Claire, who grew up in a nearby town. She used to warn me, half joking but with that serious undertone you can't ignore. If you ever hear singing in the fog, don't answer. Don't hum along. Don't even breathe loud enough for it to hear you. She never said what it was, only that people who broke the rule were never quite the same after. I didn't believe her, not until last October. It was early in the morning, and I'd gone for a hike to photograph the fog rolling through the trees. I remember how silent it was. No birds, no wind, just the soft whisper of mist sliding between the branches. The air was damp and cold enough to make my fingers ache, but I kept going, drawn deeper into the valley by the way the fog swirled like it was alive. And then I heard it. It wasn't a full song, more like a fragment. A few notes, sweet and slow, drifting through the mist. It sounded human. Not close, but not far enough to be an echo. My first thought was that someone else was hiking nearby, but there was something strange about it. The notes didn't waver, didn't catch, didn't even pause for a breath. They just flowed, smooth and unbroken, as if whoever was singing didn't need air at all. I froze, listening. The melody felt familiar in a way I couldn't place, like a lullaby I'd heard as a child, but forgotten. It was comforting. And that comfort scared me. I remembered Claire's words and, without thinking, held my breath. The song continued, weaving through the fog, sometimes nearer, sometimes farther. I told myself I should turn back, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the notes were tugging at me, pulling me deeper into the valley. That's when I saw a figure, barely visible through the mist. It stood at the edge of a cluster of trees, a tall silhouette, unmoving, the source of the song. I couldn't make out a face, or even details of its clothes, but I could see the faint curve of a smile. For reasons I still can't explain, I felt my lips part. The melody was so clear now that I almost hummed along without realizing it. My chest ached from holding my breath, and my vision swam. But then, the figure tilted its head, as if listening. The song slowed, stretched. Each note became heavier, almost sticky, clinging to the air between us. The smile didn't fade. It widened. I turned and ran. I didn't care if I lost my camera, if I tripped and fell. I just ran until my legs burned and my lungs screamed for air. By the time I reached the ridge, the fog was thinning, and the song was gone. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first. But the next morning, I found something on my porch. A damp footprint, bare and narrow, pointing toward my front door. I told myself the footprint on my porch was just a trick of my imagination. Maybe it was from a neighbor or an animal. But deep down, I knew better. It was too human, too deliberate. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the melody from my head. It played on a loop, soft and slow, as if it was waiting for me to pick up where I'd left off. I tried turning on the TV, playing music, anything to drown it out, but nothing worked. The tune always slipped back in, curling around my thoughts. That night, I woke to a sound. Not the melody, at least not exactly. It was humming. Low, steady, coming from outside my bedroom window. I live on the second floor. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat up, every instinct screaming at me not to look. But curiosity won. I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. The fog had returned, thick and pale, swirling unnaturally in the moonlight. And there, just beyond the glass, was a shadow. Tall, unmoving, its face hidden. But I could see the curve of a mouth opening and closing in perfect time with the humming. I stumbled backward, my breath catching. The humming stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. Then came a knock, 3 slow taps against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, until the fog outside began to thin and the shadow faded with it. The next morning, there were no footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. My front gate, which always squeaked loudly when opened, was hanging wide open, without a sound to wake me. Over the next few nights, the fog came more often. It didn't matter what the forecast said. It would roll in silently, bringing with it that same distant melody. Sometimes I'd hear it from the backyard, other times from down the street, and each night it seemed a little closer. One evening, desperate for answers, I asked Claire about it. Her face went pale. "You didn't hum along, did you?" she asked, her voice shaking. I told her no. "Good," she whispered. "Because once you do, it knows your voice, and it will keep singing until you join in." She wouldn't say more, but that night, I swore I could hear the melody right outside my door. And this time, it wasn't alone. There was a faint second voice, higher, softer, almost like it was waiting for a harmony. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the living room with every light on, a blanket wrapped around me, telling myself I'd wait it out. The fog would pass. It always did. But sometime after midnight, the melody began again. Faint at first, like a whisper in another room. then closer, as if it was seeping through the cracks in the walls. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The notes weren't just sound. They were inside my head now, vibrating in my chest, tugging at my breath. Through the window, I saw the fog thickening, curling into shapes that looked almost like hands pressing against the glass. And then, the humming changed. It wasn't one voice anymore. It was two. The second voice was mine. I hadn't opened my mouth. I swear I hadn't. But the harmony was there, perfect, matching the melody outside. I could feel it pulling at my lungs, coaxing me to let go and just sing. The front door creaked, slowly, quietly. I turned toward it, but the fog was already inside, swirling around my feet, my hands, my face. Through it, the figure stepped forward, the same tall silhouette from the valley, still smiling. Up close, the smile wasn't warm. It was hungry. It stopped just inches from me, tilting its head as if studying my face. And then, it leaned in, its voice weaving around mine in that same lullaby. I couldn't move, couldn't even close my eyes. The last thing I remember is the fog filling my lungs, the world fading into white, and my voice finally joining the song. I woke at sunrise, standing in the middle of the valley. My clothes were damp, my camera gone. The fog had lifted, leaving the trees silent and still. I walked home in a daze, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. But when I stepped onto my porch, there was something waiting for me. A small, hand-carved wooden whistle lying in the exact spot where the footprint had been before. When I lifted it, I realized it played only one melody, the same one I still hear sometimes, drifting through the fog. And every time, my lips part just a little further before I remember to stop. I don't know how many more times I'll be able to resist. There's a stretch of railroad deep in the Appalachian forest that doesn't appear on any map. The locals call it the Nowhere Line. They say it hasn't been used in decades, not since the accident. But if you find it on the right night, you might still hear the whistle of a train that doesn't exist anymore. I'd heard the story all my life. A passenger train derailed there sometime in the 1950s, deep in the woods, far from any station. No bodies were ever recovered, and no wreckage was found. Only the twisted rails disappearing into the trees. The company covered it up, claiming the line had been shut down long before. But people in town still whispered about the ghost train that came back looking for its missing passengers. I didn't believe in ghost stories, not until I saw the tracks for myself. It was early autumn, and I was hiking with my friend Daniel. We were following an old logging road when we stumbled across them. Rusted rails, half buried in moss, stretching in both directions until they vanished into the forest. Daniel grinned. "Bet you $5 this is the Nowhere Line." We decided to follow it. The air was cool, still, the only sound the crunch of leaves under our boots. The farther we walked, the quieter the woods became. Even the wind seemed to fade away, replaced by a strange, low hum that I thought was in my head, until Daniel asked if I heard it too. We walked for nearly an hour before we found it, a clearing where the rails cut straight through a bed of blackened gravel. In the center stood an old, crumbling signal post, its metal bent and rusted. That's when I noticed something strange. The rails here weren't rusted. They gleamed faintly, as if freshly polished, even though no train had passed in decades. Daniel crouched to touch them. "Cold," he muttered, pulling his hand back quickly. Colder than the air. The hum grew louder. It wasn't constant anymore. It had a rhythm, a pulse, almost like the steady chug of a train engine far away. Then came the whistle. It was faint, almost carried away by the wind, but it was unmistakable. That long, mournful cry of a train approaching in the distance. Except, there was no vibration in the rails, no light. Nothing but the growing sound of wheels clattering against the track, drawing nearer with every second. Daniel laughed nervously. "Guess the ghost stories are real." But he didn't sound convinced. We should have left right then. Instead, we stepped off the tracks and waited to see what would come. The sound grew deafening. The air began to tremble. A cold wind rushed past us, carrying the scent of coal smoke and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like rust and old blood. And then, through the trees, a light appeared. Not bright, not clean, but dim and flickering, like a lantern struggling to stay lit. It floated toward us, hovering just above the rails, and as it neared, I realized it wasn't a lantern at all. It was a single headlamp, mounted on the front of an engine that wasn't entirely there. The headlamp floated closer, its dim glow revealing the outline of a massive steam engine. But it wasn't solid. The metal was thin, almost transparent, with pieces of it missing entirely, like a photograph fading in spots. Yet the sound of it, the roar of the engine, the grinding of wheels on rails, was real. It was so loud I could feel it in my chest. Daniel grabbed my arm. "It's not actually there," he whispered, though I could feel his grip trembling. The engine slowed as it reached the clearing, and for the first time, I saw movement inside the cab. A man in a conductor's uniform leaned out, his cap pulled low over his eyes. His skin was pale and colorless, his mouth moving as if shouting something, but the words were swallowed by the hiss of steam. Then came the passenger cars. One by one, they slid into view, each one more faded than the last, their windows dark. But as they passed, faces began to appear, dozens of them, pale and pressed against the glass, staring out. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. Daniel took a step toward the track, as if drawn by those faces. "They're people," he murmured. I yanked him back just as the ground began to vibrate beneath us. The air grew bitterly cold, and the smell of smoke thickened, burning my throat. The conductor raised his arm and pointed directly at us. Instantly, the train screeched to a halt, but there was no screeching sound, just an eerie, sudden silence, as though the world itself had stopped. The faces in the windows turned in unison, every set of eyes fixed on us. A door slid open on the nearest car. Inside it was pitch black, but from that darkness came a faint, beckoning gesture. A pale hand curling its fingers toward us. Daniel took another step forward, his expression distant, almost hypnotized. I grabbed him again, but he didn't react. His breathing slowed, matching the steady rhythm of that low hum we'd heard earlier. I realized then, it wasn't just sound. It was pulling him. The hand inside the doorway twitched impatiently, and the cold wind around us grew sharper, cutting into my skin. I could almost hear whispers now, layered over one another, all urging the same thing. "Get on board." I shouted his name, but the forest swallowed my voice. The only sound was the faint, mournful whistle echoing through the trees, closer than before. Daniel's foot hovered over the rail. The cold coming off the train was so intense my breath turned to frost in the air. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled, but it was like trying to move a statue. His eyes were locked on the open doorway, glassy and unblinking. The pale hand inside the car curled its fingers again, slow, impatient, and the shadows in the doorway shifted. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, tall and thin, their features blurred like old photographs. They crowded near the edge, all watching us. The hum from the train grew louder, vibrating in my bones. I realized it wasn't just a sound, it was a call. It was telling us the same thing over and over. "This is your stop." I stepped in front of Daniel, shouting over the roar of the unseen engine. "You're not going anywhere!" But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the cold. The conductor tilted his head at me, then gave a sharp nod. The faces in the windows pressed closer to the glass, mouths opening in silent unison. At that moment, the cold wind turned into a sudden, violent pull, like a riptide in the air, yanking both of us toward the door. My boots scraped against the gravel as I fought it. gripping Daniel's jacket with both hands. "Daniel, snap out of it!" I shouted. For a split second, his eyes flicked toward me. That was all I needed. With one last pull, I wrenched him backward, and we both tumbled off the track, landing hard on the wet ground. The pull stopped instantly. The conductor stared down at us, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. Then he raised a gloved hand to the brim and tipped it, almost like a farewell. Without a sound, the door slid shut. The hum faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of wheels as the train began to move again. One by one, the passenger cars slipped past, the pale faces disappearing into shadow until there was nothing left but the faint glow of the headlamp. And then even that was gone. We sat there for a long time, shivering, unable to speak. When we finally made it back to town, Daniel wouldn't talk about what happened. He wouldn't even walk near the old railroad crossing on the edge of town. A week later, I found something wedged under my front door, a small, rusted ticket stub. The date on it was from 1954, the year of the accident, and on the back, written in faded ink, were 3 words. "Next time, alone." Daniel's foot hovered over the rail. The cold coming off the train was so intense my breath turned to frost in the air. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled, but it was like trying to move a statue. His eyes were locked on the open doorway, glassy and unblinking. The pale hand inside the car curled its fingers again, slow, impatient, and the shadows in the doorway shifted. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, tall and thin, their features blurred like old photographs. They crowded near the edge, all watching us. The hum from the train grew louder, vibrating in my bones. I realized it wasn't just a sound, it was a call. It was telling us the same thing over and over. "This is your stop." I stepped in front of Daniel, shouting over the roar of the unseen engine. "You're not going anywhere!" But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the cold. The conductor tilted his head at me, then gave a sharp nod. The faces in the windows pressed closer to the glass, mouths opening in silent unison. At that moment, the cold wind turned into a sudden, violent pull, like a riptide in the air, yanking both of us toward the door. My boots scraped against the gravel as I fought it, gripping Daniel's jacket with both hands. "Daniel, snap out of it!" I shouted. For a split second, his eyes flicked toward me. That was all I needed. With one last pull, I wrenched him backward, and we both tumbled off the track, landing hard on the wet ground. The pull stopped instantly. The conductor stared down at us, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. Then he raised a gloved hand to the brim and tipped it, almost like a farewell. Without a sound, the door slid shut. The hum faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of wheels as the train began to move again. One by one, the passenger cars slipped past, the pale faces disappearing into shadow until there was nothing left but the faint glow of the headlamp. And then even that was gone. We sat there for a long time, shivering, unable to speak. When we finally made it back to town, Daniel wouldn't talk about what happened. He wouldn't even walk near the old railroad crossing on the edge of town. A week later, I found something wedged under my front door, a small, rusted ticket stub. The date on it was from 1954, the year of the accident. And on the back, written in faded ink, were 3 words: "Next time, alone." There's a stretch of forest in the Appalachians that hikers avoid, not because of bears or snakes or even bad weather, but because of something stranger. The locals call it the Shadowless Grove. They say when you walk under its trees, you lose your shadow, not just in the way shade hides it, but gone, completely. And once it's gone, it doesn't always come back. I'd always thought it was a campfire story, something to scare kids away from wandering too far. That is, until last summer, when I saw it for myself. I was out mapping trails for a photography project, alone, late in the afternoon. The sun was still high, casting long lines of light through the canopy. My shadow stretched ahead of me as I walked, until it didn't. It happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice. One moment, my shadow was there, dark and sharp on the dirt. The next, it was gone, as if I'd stepped off the earth entirely. The sunlight still poured through the trees, dappling the ground, but nothing of me fell across it. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart thudding. I lifted my arm, waved my hand, even stamped my foot. Nothing. It was as if I'd become invisible to the sun. I told myself it had to be the angle of the light, maybe some strange trick of the canopy. But as I stood there, I realized something else. Everything was silent. Not just quiet. Silent. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves. Not even the sound of my own breathing seemed to carry right. That's when I saw movement. Between the trees, shapes drifted. Not animals, not people, but outlines. They were faint, like heat ripples in the air, and they moved without sound or weight. Each one slid along the ground, stretching and bending like shadows. Except they weren't attached to anything. One of them stopped. Slowly, it turned, if you could call it turning, and faced me. I couldn't see a face, but somehow I felt its attention, sharp and cold, like a sudden drop in temperature. The shape began to slide toward me. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on a root. For a split second, my hand reached into the sunlight at the edge of the grove, and my shadow flickered back, just for an instant, before vanishing again. That was when I realized I'd crossed into a place where the sun still shone. But light didn't belong to me anymore. The longer I stood there, the more wrong everything felt. The sunlight was bright, but it didn't feel warm anymore. It had a hollow quality, like light from a dying bulb. My skin prickled, and the air pressed against me as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The shifting outline that had noticed me was closer now. It didn't glide like mist or move like smoke. It crawled, stretching thin and snapping back together in jerky movements. The edges of it wavered, bleeding into the air, but there was weight in the way it approached, a pull that made my stomach knot. I forced myself to step back toward where I thought the trail was, but it wasn't there anymore. Every tree looked the same, their trunks unnaturally straight, their branches unnervingly still. The world felt flat, depthless, like I was standing inside a photograph. The outline stopped a few feet from me. Then, slowly, it rose, lengthening until it stood taller than the surrounding trees. Its form bent at strange angles, like a shadow cast by something that didn't match its source. That's when I realized it was shaped like me. Not exactly. Its arms were too long, its head tilted too far to one side, but the proportions were close enough to make my stomach turn. And in the middle of its faceless head, a faint indentation formed, like the suggestion of eyes. I stepped back again, my boots scuffing the dirt. The sound, small as it was, made the thing twitch. Then, with unnatural speed, it lunged forward, stretching toward my feet. The ground seemed to dim where it touched, as though stealing what little light was left. I bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring which way I went. But no matter how far I ran, the sunlight stayed cold, and the ground under me stayed shadowless. The forest began to change. The trees leaned inward, their trunks warped and twisting like they were bending to watch me pass. Every so often, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, more of those outlines, keeping pace with me. They didn't make a sound, but I could feel them there, gliding just beyond reach. Then, ahead, I saw it. A break in the trees. Real light spilled through, warm and golden, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I saw shadows on the ground. I ran for it, but as I reached the edge, something long and cold wrapped around my ankle. The grip on my ankle was icy, but not like winter cold. It was the kind of chill that seeps inside you, heavy and still. I looked down and saw nothing solid, only a smear of darkness clinging to my leg like a stain in the air. It stretched back into the forest, twisting and coiling, until it melted into one of the shadow shapes. It pulled. My body jerked backward, heels digging into the dirt as I clawed toward the sunlight just ahead. The warmth of it was so close I could almost feel it on my face. But the pull from behind was relentless. Patient, I kicked hard, my boot passing straight through the smear of darkness without resistance. But the thing didn't let go. It crawled higher, wrapping around my calf, my knee. The edges of my vision darkened, and I realized my breathing was growing shallow, like the air here didn't want to stay in my lungs. Then I remembered the flicker. That moment earlier when my shadow had come back for just an instant. I twisted onto my side, stretching my free hand toward the patch of sunlight spilling through the trees. The darkness hesitated, its pull faltering. I pushed harder, fingers brushing the edge of the light. Warm, real light. And the smear on my leg began to recoil, shrinking back into the forest. I scrambled forward, dragging myself into the sun. And just like that, it was gone. I lay there for a long time, gasping, the golden warmth soaking into my skin. When I finally dared to look back, the forest behind me was the same as any other. Quiet, still, nothing unusual. But the patch of ground where I'd been pulled was bare, stripped of leaves, the dirt darker than the rest. I thought I was safe, until, later that night, I walked past a mirror in my cabin. I stopped dead. The reflection showed me standing there, but there was no shadow behind me. The light was right, the angle perfect, yet the floor was empty, and just as I leaned closer to the glass, I saw something move in it, something tall and thin, standing just over my shoulder. In a small Appalachian village, there's an old superstition that everyone knows, even if they don't believe it. If you hear 3 knocks at your door after midnight, don't answer. They say it's not a person on the other side. It's an invitation. And once you open that door, something steps in that you can't ever send away. I'd heard the story from my grandmother when I was a kid. She told it with a seriousness that stuck with me long after I stopped believing in monsters. 3 knocks, she'd say, tapping the table slowly. Never 2, never 4, always 3. And they're not asking to come in. They're telling you they already have. I moved away for years, but last winter, after a bad breakup and a worse job loss, I came back to the old family house to figure out my next move. The village was quieter than I remembered. Half the houses empty, the rest sagging with age. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my evenings by the fireplace, trying to ignore the way the wind seemed to creep under the windowsills. Then, on the 4th night, just past midnight, I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy, each sound spaced too perfectly apart to be random. My first thought was that it was a neighbor in trouble. Snow had been falling all day, and the road was slick. But when I looked through the front window, the yard was empty. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. No more knocks, no voices, no footprints in the fresh snow outside. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been the wood settling in the cold. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same slow, deliberate rhythm. This time, when I peered through the window, I saw something. A figure stood at the very edge of the porch light's reach. Small, hunched, wearing what looked like tattered clothes. It didn't move, didn't shiver in the cold. I couldn't see its face, only that its head was tilted slightly, as if listening. And before I could blink, it stepped backward into the darkness and vanished. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made me flinch, and the wind seemed to drag across the siding in long, whispering strokes. I kept telling myself the figure I saw could have been a trick of the light, or even a stray hiker looking for shelter. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nobody in this village would knock 3 times after dark. The next evening, I left every light in the house on and the TV playing, hoping noise would drown out my nerves. But right on schedule, just past midnight, it came again. This time it wasn't from the front door. It came from the side of the house, right outside my bedroom window. I froze, my hand halfway to the lamp. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint outline in the fabric. Something was standing inches away, tall enough that its head nearly brushed the top of the window frame. I didn't move, neither did it. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted. The knocking started again, softer this time. 3 delicate taps, as if it was testing how thin the glass really was. I backed away, my foot catching on the rug. The floor groaned under my weight, and the shadow's head twitched toward the sound. The knocking stopped. A moment later, I heard it again, this time at the back door. I crept to the kitchen, every step deliberate, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. Through the small window in the door, I saw nothing but the pale glow of snow under the porch light. I exhaled in relief, until something shifted in the corner of my vision. It was standing just beyond the light, the same hunched figure as before. But now I could see its hands, long, thin fingers that ended in dark, uneven tips, twitching slightly in the cold. It didn't knock this time. It just stood there, head tilted in that same listening posture, waiting. When I blinked, it was gone. The house felt smaller after that night, like the walls were leaning in. I started keeping a chair wedged under the front door handle and a heavy flashlight within reach. 2 days passed with no sign of the figure. I began to think maybe it had given up, until the 3rd night. The knocks came at exactly midnight, only this time, they weren't at the door or the windows. They came from inside the house. The sound was faint, muffled, but it was unmistakable. 3 slow taps against the wall of my bedroom from the other side. I sat up in bed, every nerve on edge. The wall it came from led to the empty guest room. I forced myself out of bed, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The guest room door was closed, just as I'd left it. I reached for the knob and hesitated. The wood felt colder than the rest of the house. Then, 3 more knocks, this time from behind me. I spun around. My bedroom door was wide open. The hallway beyond was dark, the kind of dark that swallows light whole. I raised the flashlight, but the beam barely reached halfway down before dissolving into black. From within that blackness, something stepped forward, small, hunched, head tilted in that unnatural listening way. It moved soundlessly, closing the distance 1 slow step at a time, until I could make out its face, or what was left of one. The features were faint, blurred, like a memory I couldn't quite place. But the mouth was stretched into a slow, patient smile. I backed into my room and slammed the door, locking it and shoving the chair against the handle. The knocks didn't come again that night. The next morning, the house looked normal. The doors were closed, the snow outside was untouched. But on my bedroom wall, right above where my head rests when I sleep, there were 3 long, dark marks, spaced perfectly apart. That was 2 weeks ago, and last night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Not on the door, not on the wall. This time it came from inside the closet.